American automakers have long touted power, style, and freedom on four wheels, but not every car was a masterpiece. Some were disasters. Poorly engineered, dangerously unsafe, mechanically incompetent, or just painfully ugly. These vehicles didn't just fail, they embarrassed entire companies, frustrated owners, and in some cases caused deaths. These are the 10 worst American cars ever produced, the ones you wouldn't believe existed if it weren't for the metal, paint, and rust still lying around in forgotten corners.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. GM in the 1970s was desperate to compete with fuel-efficient imports like Toyota, Datsun, and Volkswagen. The Vega was supposed to be the savior: lightweight aluminum engine, modern design, low price. But instead of a hero, GM produced one of the worst engineered cars in American history. Pontiac, a brand known for performance, was given the job of dressing this disaster up in new clothes. The Astre was essentially a Vega with a Pontiac grille, a few chrome accents, slightly different trim levels. But beneath the skin, the same problems remained, and in some cases were worse. The 1977 Astre came with GM's notorious 2.3-liter aluminum inline-4, one of the most unreliable engines ever put into a mass-market car. Its failures were legendary. Cylinder walls wore out prematurely. Overheating was almost guaranteed. Head gaskets blew like popcorn. Oil consumption could hit a quart every 300 to 500 miles. Engines died before 40,000 miles. Mechanics joked that Vegas and Asters didn't break in, they break down. By 1977, GM tried patching the design, adding cast iron liners into the aluminum block. But the damage to its reputation was already irreversible. Owners remained terrified every time the temperature needle climbed. The Astre inherited the same bad sheet metal as the Vega: thin, poorly protected steel, minimal rust proofing, fenders and rocker panels that corroded within the first year. In snowy climates, cars would literally rust while sitting in parking lots. Owners reported seeing bubbling paint and brown streaks on cars still under warranty. Rust became the Astre's calling card. Drive it today, tomorrow it's dust. Pontiac marketed the Astre as sporty. Nothing could be further from the truth. 0 to 60 miles per hour, around 15 to 18 seconds, depending on how kind the wind was. Handling: sloppy, vague, with body roll that could induce seasickness. Brakes: weak and prone to fade. Even by late 70s standards, an era not known for performance, the Astre felt painfully slow. Motor Trend described the driving experience as uninspiring. Owners called it an engine-powered nap. Open the door of a 77 Astre and you entered a world of brittle plastics, cheap vinyl, misaligned panels, rattles that started at 1,000 miles. The cabin felt like the waiting room of a discount dentist, uncomfortable, ugly, and somehow already worn out. The seats had padding equivalent to a folded newspaper. If you've ever wondered what a car looks like when built with budget constraints, corporate bureaucracy, poor engineering, panic about foreign competition, the Pontiac Astre was the answer. The list of common failures included carburetor clogs, ignition system glitches, blown radiators, fragile timing belts, faulty fuel pumps. You needed a toolbox in the trunk just to make it to work. The Astre entered the American market already carrying the curse of its Chevy brother. By 1977, car magazines mocked it. Dealerships struggled to sell it. Owners regretted it. Thieves avoided it. There's a famous anecdote. A car thief reportedly walked past an Astre, saw what it was, and chose to steal a bicycle instead. Part 8V. Legacy, the last gasp of a fading brand. Pontiac's performance image took serious damage. The Astre was one of the early signs that Pontiac's glory days, the GTO, Firebird, Trans Am, were slipping away. The brand's identity became confused. Was it sporty? Was it economical? Was it just a rebadged Chevy? The answer, tragically, became the last one. By 1977, the Astre was the final year of production. GM quietly retired the name, hoping history would forget it. To no surprise, it mostly did. The 1977 Pontiac Astre stands as a powerful reminder of what happens when engineers are ignored, quality is compromised, corners are cut, marketing overrides reality. It is a vehicle that proved a hard truth. You cannot fix a fundamentally bad design with chrome trim and a Pontiac badge. Number 9. The early 1970s was a violent shakeup in the automotive world. Federal emissions mandates, oil embargoes, skyrocketing fuel prices, and tightening safety regulations smashed into Detroit at the same time. Overnight, powerful V8 engines, once the pride of American engineering, were strangled into weak, asthmatic versions of their former selves. The 1974 Chevrolet Impala is one of the clearest examples of this downfall. Once the crown jewel of GM's full-size lineup, the Impala had dominated American roads since the late 1950s. But by 1974, it became a lumbering, underpowered relic, a product of corporate panic and government pressure. From muscle glory to malaise misery. Prior to the 1970s, Chevy V8s were powerful, reliable, and iconic. 327 small block, 350 small block, 396 big block, 454 big block. These engines powered everything from family sedans to drag strip monsters. Then emissions controls hit. 1974 was the first full year of catalytic converters, EGR valves, retarded ignition timing, and primitive exhaust gas recirculation systems. The effect on performance was catastrophic. Chevy's engineers scrambled to make engines cleaner, but lacked the technology to do it efficiently. Fuel injection was still years away. Electronic engine management didn't exist. Everything was mechanical, crude, and rushed. The heart of the problem was the heart of the car. Depending on the trim, the 1974 Impala came with a 350 V8, 400 V8, 454 V8. But these power plants had been brutally neutered. The 375 from hero to hamster. Once capable of 300-plus horsepower in the 1960s, the 1974 version produced as low as 145 to 160 horsepower. That's minivan territory. The 400, a giant block making about 180 horsepower, choking on its own emissions hardware. The 454, the cruelest tragedy. The legendary 454 had produced 450 horsepower at its peak just a few years earlier. In the 1974 Impala, 235 horsepower. That's a 48% power reduction. And it still drank fuel like a sailor on shore leave. The mechanical plague. The stuff bolted onto the engine to meet regulations became a nightmare. Restrictive catalytic converters, EGR valves that clogged, lean carburetor tuning, vacuum hoses everywhere, air pumps that robbed power, retarded ignition timing. The result? Choking, stumbling, gasping engines. These systems were primitive, unreliable, and incompatible. Cars couldn't idle smoothly. Acceleration felt like dragging a piano uphill. The engines detonated, overheated, and ran rough even when new. Imagine driving a 4,500-pound full-size sedan with 145 horsepower, 2-barrel carburetor, soft suspension, sloppy steering, drum brakes. Acceleration was glacial. 0 to 60 miles per hour, 14 to 17 seconds. Quarter mile, slow enough to brew coffee before finishing. Motor Trend and Car and Driver compared it to driving a barge, a sofa, and a very large disappointment. The steering was vague and over-assisted. You could turn the wheel 15 degrees before anything happened. The brakes faded after a few stops, and the suspension wallowed and floated like a waterbed on wheels. GM's quality control had already nosedived by the mid-70s. Misaligned panels, cheap plastic trim, poor paint quality, loose wiring, fragile upholstery. Owners complained of dashboard rattles, doors that didn't seal properly, leaks in trunks, squeaks everywhere. Combine that with the mechanical mess under the hood, and the Impala quickly became a symbol of Detroit's crisis. Chevy tried to improve emissions and fuel economy simultaneously, with predictable disaster. Despite being detuned, the Impala still got 8 to 12 mpg, meaning it had less power, worse drivability, and nearly the same awful fuel economy. It was a lose-lose experiment. The Impala, once America's favorite full-size car, had become an embarrassment. Drivers hated it. Mechanics cursed it. Dealers struggled to move it off lots. Car buyers in 1974 looked at its poor performance, reliability issues, monstrous size, and started flocking to Japanese alternatives. Chevrolet's big, thirsty sedans suddenly looked prehistoric next to nimble Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics. The 1974 Impala is a textbook case study in regulatory overreaction, corporate mismanagement, technological lag, poor engineering compromises. It's often cited as one of the cars that drove American consumers away from Detroit and toward foreign brands. Ironically, some gearheads love these cars today for their sheer absurdity. Giant V8s struggling to outrun a Volkswagen Beetle. A lesson in what happens when progress outpaces technology. The 1974 Impala stands as a monument to an era where the auto industry had lost its direction. It teaches us that emissions controls without proper technology cripple performance. Rushed engineering destroys reliability. Gigantic cars with tiny power are a recipe for disaster. And even legends can be brought to their knees. The 1974 Impala didn't just fail. It symbolized failure, and that makes it one of the most important, if miserable, cars of the 1970s. Number 8. In 1971, Chrysler Corporation was desperate for something, anything, to compete in America's exploding compact car market. Japanese automakers were multiplying. Volkswagen was riding high with the Beetle. Ford had the Pinto, Chevrolet had the Vega, and AMC had the Gremlin. Chrysler, meanwhile, had nothing small, cheap, or fuel-efficient enough. Their solution was to take a British car, a modest little sedan known in the UK as the Hillman Avenger, slap a Plymouth badge on its grille, and send it across the Atlantic. They named it the Plymouth Cricket, hoping the cheerful-sounding name would win American hearts. It didn't. In fact, it quickly became one of the most notorious failures in Chrysler history. The Cricket might have been tolerable in Britain, where roads were narrow, cars were smaller, owners expected modest power, but America demanded something entirely different: long-distance durability, strong air conditioning, reliable cold starts, easy access to replacement parts, engines capable of highway speeds. The Cricket wasn't designed for any of those things. Its 1.5-liter four-cylinder engine produced barely 70 horsepower. On British roads, that was adequate. On American highways, it was unsafe. Drivers described merging onto freeways as a prayer session, a wind-up toy trying to outrun real cars, or an event filled with terror and mechanical screaming. The Cricket had a reputation for breaking down within weeks of ownership, and not just small annoyances, catastrophic failures, carburetors that wouldn't stay tuned, overheating even in mild weather, engines that stalled at intersections, electrical systems prone to shorts, timing belt failures, exhaust systems rusting out prematurely. And then there were the cold weather issues. British cars of the early 1970s were not built with American winters in mind. Owners in northern states discovered that the Cricket wouldn't start in cold weather, lost power at sub-freezing temperatures, had heaters that barely worked. Meanwhile, southern owners discovered the opposite problem. The Cricket's air conditioning failed constantly, often right out of the showroom. A nightmare for dealers and customers alike. Because the Cricket was built by Chrysler's subsidiary, Roots Group, parts had to be shipped from overseas through an underprepared supply chain. This meant repairs took weeks, sometimes months. Even Chrysler dealers didn't know how to fix them. Mechanics weren't trained on British components or metric fasteners. They treated it like an alien. Many owners said the same phrase, "My dealer had no idea what to do with it." Timmy, cheap, and fragile. The Cricket's body felt like it was made from recycled soup cans. Common complaints included doors that bent when closed too hard, window cranks falling off, rust appearing within the first year, thin sheet metal denting easily, plastic interior parts cracking in sunlight. The suspension was soft and underdamped, giving it a floaty, wobbly ride. Steering feel was vague. Brakes faded quickly. Handling was unpredictable. Combine all that with its gutless engine, and the Cricket became a car that could neither go fast, nor stop reliably, nor hold itself together. By 1971, Americans had access to Toyota Corolla, reliable, Datsun 510, sporty, Volkswagen Beetle, iconic, Pinto and Vega, cheap and familiar. The Cricket had no style, no performance, no reliability, no marketing advantage. Its styling was plain to the point of invisibility. It looked like a refrigerator box with wheels. There were no unique traits, no personality, no selling point. Even Chrysler executives privately admitted it looked like an afterthought. Sales collapsed almost immediately. The reputation was so bad that Plymouth dealers often refused to take more Crickets for inventory. By 1973, the Cricket was dead. It lasted barely 2 years on the American market. Many unsold units were scrapped or repurposed for parts. Very few survive today. The Cricket's failure taught Chrysler a painful lesson. You cannot simply import a foreign car and expect Americans to embrace it. Reliability and serviceability matter more than nameplates. Engineering must match the environment. It is also a precursor to Chrysler's later successes. The backlash from the Cricket would eventually push them to develop the K-Car platform, a domestic small car solution that helped save the company later in the decade. In that sense, the Cricket's failure indirectly led to Chrysler's revival. The Cricket wasn't just bad. It was a perfect storm of bad decisions. The 1971 Plymouth Cricket stands as one of the most infamous failures in Chrysler history. It was poorly suited to American drivers, miserably unreliable, difficult to repair, cheaply built, underpowered, and completely unappealing. It tried to be a compact for a market that demanded durability, styling, and power, and delivered none of those things. Today, it is remembered not as a collectible, not as a quirky classic, but as a cautionary tale of corporate desperation, global misalignment, and how not to introduce a foreign-built car into the U.S. Number 7. In 1958, American Motors Corporation, AMC, was fighting for its survival. The Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were churning out larger, more flamboyant cars every year. George Romney, AMC's visionary CEO, believed in compact cars long before the rest of Detroit did. He was right in principle. But AMC didn't have the money to design an all-new car immediately. So they revived a leftover design, literally dusted off old tooling from the 1950 to 1955 Nash Rambler, and reintroduced it as the all-new Rambler American. Except it wasn't new. It was a car from the early 1950s, masquerading as a product for the late 1950s, and buyers could tell. AMC was desperate. They needed something cheap to produce, cheap to sell, and fast to market. The solution: reuse old tooling from a discontinued model. This meant the new 1958 Rambler American had a body shape designed 8 years earlier, outdated engineering, a chassis that predated modern crash protection concepts, narrow track and short wheelbase, old-school leaf spring rear suspension. Even the manufacturing equipment was old. Assembly quality was inconsistent because some of the tooling had been sitting idle for years, rusting. The result? A car that rode and handled like the early 1950s in an era that demanded something modern. A time capsule of obsolete ideas. Under the hood was AMC's ancient 195.6 cubic inch flathead inline six. Low compression, low power, about 90 horsepower, poor breathing, sluggish acceleration. It was reliable in the tractor engine sense, but it belonged to the Eisenhower era, not the space age. By 1958, competitors offered overhead valve engines with much better performance and efficiency. Drivers reported slow starts, frequent valve clatter, poor highway passing power. On highways, the car vibrated so much that drivers said it felt like it was signaling distress. It shook, rattled, and begged for mercy. Those weren't exaggerations. Those were lived experiences. A symphony of shakes, rattles, and had enough clunks. Because AMC reused a chassis engineered years earlier, the suspension was crude and underdamped. Common complaints included harsh ride over bumps, swaying on curves, excessive body roll, metal-to-metal noises from worn bushings, dashboard rattles at anything above 40 miles per hour. On the highway, it vibrated so intensely that many owners described driving the car as piloting a washing machine full of loose bolts. The short wheelbase made every expansion joint feel like an impact. The rear potty leaf spring gave the rear end a tendency to hop, and the steering box, which used 1950s tolerances, felt loose even on new cars. The result? A car that inspired absolutely no confidence at speed. Outdated the day it debuted. In 1958, Detroit styling was all about jet-inspired fins, chrome excess, space-age touches, long, low silhouettes. The Rambler American looked like it drove straight out of 1952. Tall, narrow, stubby, and plain. Not retro, just old. Its proportions were pre-styling era. No fins, no flair, no sense of modernity. Critics joked that it looks like a refrigerator on wheels, a car designed before the concept of design. The most charitable reviews called it practical, which, in 1958 automobile marketing, was practically an insult. Compromises everywhere. Because AMC recycled old tooling, the car lacked the structural improvements that most automakers adopted by 1958. Safety issues included no reinforced crash structures, weak door latches, sharp metal edges in the cabin, thin sheet metal that dented easily. The frame wasn't designed for mid-1950s speeds, let alone late 1950s highway realities. At 60-plus miles an hour, the car wandered badly, not because of wind, but because of the steering geometry itself. AMC never intended this design to be used in a high-speed interstate environment. Yet here it was, forced to compete with modern V8-powered machines. The definition of good enough if you had no other choice. Despite its flaws, the Rambler American did sell, not because it was good, but because it was cheap and because the 1958 recession hit hard. Buyers wanted affordable, simple transportation. The American was that, even if it was outdated. But professional reviewers were brutally honest. It feels a decade old. A tiny car with a tired heart. Utility without pleasure. Motor Trend said it was practical but uninspiring. Consumer Reports liked its economy but criticized its ride, noise, and outdated feel. In other words, people bought it out of necessity, not desire. Not a classic, but a survivor with stories. The 1958 Rambler American is remembered today as a symbol of AMC's resourcefulness, a relic of recycled engineering, a compact car that sold in spite of itself, a vehicle that felt old before it hit showrooms. It's not collectible, it's not iconic, it's not beloved, but it is historically fascinating because it shows how far AMC had to stretch to compete on a shoestring budget. Its success helped AMC survive long enough to develop better cars, paving the way for the later Rambler Classic and the iconic AMC Hornet. So, in that sense, the Rambler American's outdated bones helped save the company. The Rambler American was a survival car, not a success story. The 1958 Rambler American shook, rattled, and groaned its way through history. It was underpowered, outdated, noisy, shaky at speed, and ancient in design. But it served a purpose. It kept AMC alive in a brutal market. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that sometimes a car's value isn't in its engineering brilliance, but in its ability to exist long enough for a company to build something better. Number 6. To understand the 1980 Dodge St. Regis, you have to understand where Chrysler was in 1979 to 1980. Bankrupt, drowning in debt, bleeding market share, and praying that the K-car would save the company. But in the midst of gas crises, downsizing, and rising Japanese competition, Chrysler launched a full-size land yacht, an old-school barge called the St. Regis. It was supposed to be the company's answer to GM's and Ford's downsized big sedans. Instead, it was Chrysler's last gasp of the old Detroit mentality: big, heavy, underpowered, and slapped together with no time, no money, and no hope. The R-body disaster. The St. Regis rode on the infamous R-body platform, which was little more than a recycling job. Chrysler took the B-body architecture from the 1970s, itself already dated, made minor adjustments, cut wheelbases, and called it new. But underneath, it was still body-on-frame construction, crude weight distribution, sloppy suspension geometry, outdated steering setup, brakes designed for lighter, earlier cars. R-body cars were heavy, sluggish, and horrifically inefficient. Chrysler engineers knew it. Dealers knew it. Customers hated it. A refrigerator box on 4 wheels. When you look at the St. Regis, you instantly understand why people described it as a gigantic box. It was square, tall, excessively slab-sided, with awkward vertical taillights and styling that screamed government fleet. It made no attempt to look aerodynamic or modern. Even by 1980 standards, and this was an era not known for elegance, it looked ancient and uninspired. At a time when GM was pushing smoother lines and Ford was experimenting with aerodynamic forms, Chrysler gave us a rolling tool shed disguised as a sedan. The sofa on roller skates phenomenon. The driving experience was infamous. Slow ratio, numb feel, huge dead zone, power steering that overboosted, wander at highway speed. It was like guiding a runaway couch through traffic. Soft springs, mushy shocks, constant bottoming out, violent body roll in turns. It didn't corner. It simply leaned into the turn like a drunken cruise ship. Engine up front, nothing in the back, a recipe for instability. The rear end would step out in wet weather, power slide unintentionally, fishtail during emergency braking. No sports sedan pretensions here. This was a car that refused to handle at any speed. The worst part of an already bad package. The St. Regis was notorious for having subpar braking systems. Why? Chrysler cheaped out. To save money, the company installed undersized front discs, weak calipers, and rear drums that overheated instantly. Police departments bought these cars in bulk, especially the California Highway Patrol, and within months they were filing complaints. At high speeds, the brakes faded so badly that officers were unable to perform routine emergency stops. After several fatal crashes, departments demanded they be replaced. CHP literally parked their St. Regis patrol fleet and refused to drive them. You know a car is bad when cops won't use it. Engines that tried their best but couldn't save the car. You could order the St. Regis with a 225 slant 6, only 90-ish horsepower, a 318 V8, or a 360 V8. All were choked by emissions controls. They were underpowered for such a heavy platform. Acceleration was pathetic. A 0 to 60 time in the 18 to 20 second range for the six-cylinder was typical. With a V8, it was still sluggish. Fuel economy? Abysmal. 10 to 12 miles per gallon city, maybe 15 highway. In an era where buyers demanded efficiency, this was suicidal. When Chrysler was held together with hope and duct tape. Chrysler's build quality in this era was legendarily poor. Common St. Regis issues included inconsistent panel gaps, misaligned doors, dashboard rattles from day one, electrical gremlins, vacuum leaks, failing transmissions. Many cars left the factory with mismatched paint or ill-fitting chrome. This wasn't craftsmanship, it was crisis management. Number 5. The early 1960s were a period of transition. Ford was riding high on the success of the Falcon line, the most successful compact car in America at that time. The formula was simple: cheap to build, cheap to sell, simple to maintain, no thrills whatsoever. In that environment, the idea of a sedan delivery made sense. Take the base Falcon, close up the rear windows, remove the back seats, and voila! Instant business van. Except, it wasn't that simple. If you want to understand the 1962 Falcon sedan delivery, imagine a panel van that has been aggressively stripped of any personality or ergonomics. No chrome upgrades, no passenger appeal, no sound insulation, hard vinyl everything, bare bones dash. This was the kind of vehicle you bought not because you wanted it, but because you needed something that moved items from point A to point B and didn't bankrupt you. But Ford's obsession with cutting costs meant compromises everywhere. Under the hood, the legendary Ford 144 cubic inch inline six. Legendary in the sense that it was known for its lack of enthusiasm. A meager 85 horsepower, sluggish acceleration, barely enough torque to move a load of anything heavier than newspapers. A 3-speed column shift manual that felt like stirring cement. Fully loaded with cargo, the Falcon sedan delivery struggled on hills, groaned on highways, and refused to pass anything except maybe a bicycle. Even delivery drivers complained. On the road, this thing rode like a cheap motel bed frame on casters. Harsh suspension, thin sheet metal, barely there seats. The Falcon sedan delivery offered zero comfort, a serious issue for anyone who drove one for hours as part of their job. Every pothole transmitted directly to your spine. Every bump made the interior rattle like a loose toolbox. Noise? Plenty of it. With no insulation, you heard road noise, engine whine, cargo vibrating, your own regrets. The cabin was a masterclass in frugality. Ford removed carpeting, upholstery upgrades, even basic creature comforts. The dashboard looked like something designed by a team of accountants and stamped in 2 minutes. The materials seemed allergic to quality. And the cargo area? Bare metal. That was it. Tools rolled around, boxes slid, everything made noise. Business owners often had to install their own shelves and padding because Ford simply didn't bother. Here's the irony. The Falcon platform itself was reliable, but the sedan delivery variant suffered from overworked engines, weak transmissions, premature rust, electrical quirks, and poor weather sealing. Rainstorms? Expect leaks. Winter? Expect corrosion. Summer? Expect heat pouring in from every angle. Despite being a delivery vehicle, it had surprising flaws. Limited payload capacity, even slight loads made it wheeze. Tiny rear door opening, awkward for bulky items. Low ground clearance, bottomed out easily. For many small businesses, this meant extra work and extra frustration. The Falcon sedan delivery sold poorly. Most buyers weren't fooled. It didn't offer enough over a standard Stag & Wagon or a real commercial van. Ford quietly phased it out. By mid-decade, it vanished, barely a footnote in Falcon history. Today, the 1962 Ford Falcon sedan delivery serves as an example of how cost-cutting becomes self-defeating when it goes too far. It lacked charm, performance, practicality, and comfort. It wasn't disastrous enough to be infamous. It wasn't good enough to be remembered. It simply existed. A true accountant's car built for businesses that didn't have a choice and driven by people who wished they didn't have to. Number 4. By 1979, AMC was in survival mode. Chrysler was collapsing, GM was sweating over fuel economy regulations, and Ford was trying to make the Mustang II cool again. But AMC? AMC didn't have the money to develop new platforms or engines. So what did they do? They took the aging Hornet platform, born in 1970, and tried to reinvent it as a premium compact. Suddenly, the old Hornet became the AMC Concord, complete with marketing slogans like "Luxury you can afford." Translation: we slapped on some trim and hope you don't notice it's still a 9-year-old car underneath. Nothing screams budget luxury like fake wood grain, and AMC used it liberally. Wood grain paneling on the sides, wood grain on the dash, wood grain you could peel with your fingernails. Meanwhile, chrome trims and accents were often just plastic coated with shiny foil. A few seasons in the sun, and these pieces flaked and faded like cheap costume jewelry. The front fascia, a desperate attempt to look upscale, featuring jumbo rectangular headlights, a grille with more chrome than quality, bumpers that looked like shiny train buffers. All of it screamed 1970s design on a 1960s budget. Inside, the Concord tried to bring luxury. To AMC, this meant pillow-like seats, carpet that felt like shag, dash material softer than a dollar store teddy bear. It was comfortable, yes, but not in the refined Cadillac or Lincoln way, more like a cheap sofa that's 5 years past its prime. You sank into the seats, and when you turned a corner, the seats helped you continue sliding in that direction. The cabin was quiet only because the suspension was absorbing every sound by bouncing like a trampoline. Here's where the Concord became legendary, for all the wrong reasons. AMC's engineers wanted soft, so they softened everything. Soft springs, soft shocks, soft bushings, soft stabilizers. Result? This car floated. Not smooth Lexus float, not old Cadillac glide. No, this was broken waterbed float, unpredictable, sloppy, and nauseating. Hit a bump, the Concord bobbed up and down like a buoy in a storm. Corner, the body leaned so far you thought the door handles would scrape the pavement. Drivers often described it as comfortable until you actually try to drive it. AMC didn't have the luxury of offering variety. Your choices in 1979 were a 232 cubic inch inline six, which was adequate, a 258 cubic inch inline six, which was less adequate but torquier, and the 304 V8, optional but pointless. The six-cylinder engines were strong and durable, but they weren't powerful. The V8 made about 120 horsepower on a good day, smog-strangled, emission-choked, and bored by its own existence. Acceleration was best described as determined but uninspiring. AMC produced some rugged vehicles. The Concord wasn't one of them. Common issues included leaky seals, rust-prone body panels, electrical gremlins, drooping headliners, trim pieces falling off. Some owners joked that you could identify a Concord after 10 years by the bits of chrome and wood grain trailing behind it. Even with all its issues, the Concord actually sold reasonably well in 1979. Why? It was cheap, it was comfortable, gas was expensive, and American buyers trusted AMC's six-cylinder engines. But reasonably well wasn't enough to save AMC. Within a few years, the platform felt ancient, the quality issues mounted, and the competition, especially from Japanese brands, wiped it out. Today, the 1979 AMC Concord has a strange legacy. It's remembered as a car that tried too hard, a car built on the bones of an older car, a car that floated like a waterbed, a final attempt at making luxury out of a compact platform. Collectors don't chase them. Restorers ignore them. And automotive historians treat it as AMC's last gasp before the era of Renault alliances and eventual Chrysler absorption. The 1979 AMC Concord wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't the luxury car AMC wanted it to be. It was a compromise, and you could feel every compromise in the way it drove, rode, looked, and aged. It was AMC's attempt to polish an old platform into something new, and in the process, they proved a painful truth. You can't fake luxury with fake wood and plastic chrome. Number 3. By 1985, GM was obsessed with platform sharing. They wanted efficiency, reduced costs, and the ability to churn out cars like a fast food chain produces hamburgers. Enter the A-body platform, shared by Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, and Buick Century. Same car, 4 badges, A few different trim pieces, done. It was GM's attempt to make a middle-of-the-road mid-size sedan that wouldn't offend anyone, which is exactly what they achieved. But in the process, they created a vehicle that had all the excitement of tap water. Let's look at the celebrity's appearance. It was, well, beige. Not necessarily in color, though that was common, but in spirit. Key design features: boxy, square lines, unremarkable grille, uninspired side profile, generic taillights, vinyl top if you wanted to feel premium, which nobody did. Nothing about the exterior said, "Look at me." Everything said, "Please don't." In a world of turbocharged sports cars, futuristic wedges, and bold European styling, the celebrity looked like a photocopied drawing of a car. Not bad, not good, just there. Step inside and you'd find hard plastics, thin cloth upholstery, fake wood that fooled absolutely no one, dash vents that rattled from day one, a speedometer that looked like it came from a kitchen timer. The steering wheel was the size of a hula hoop, and the seats were about as supportive as a cheap motel mattress. If you wanted luxury, you could order the Euro Sport trim, which gave you red pinstripes, stiffer suspension, and sporty badges. It didn't make the car sporty, it only made the badges sporty. Here's where the celebrity earned its reputation. While GM sold millions of them, they were plagued by transmission failures, especially the TH125 automatic, electrical issues, mysterious as poltergeists, fuel injection problems, flooding, stalling, rough idle, weak alternators, dying prematurely, suspension wear, turning the car into a wobbly mess. Owners often joked that the celebrity's most reliable feature was the check engine light. And when these cars broke down by the side of the road, which was not uncommon, they blended into the scenery so well that other drivers barely noticed them. Under the hood, you had engines like 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder, slow but durable, 2.8-liter V6, slightly faster but prone to early wear. Horsepower ranged from barely enough to just enough. Acceleration was measured not in seconds, but in patience. Passing on the highway required planning, confidence, and a prayer. Handling? Think soft, wallowy, and vague. The kind of suspension tuning that made every curve feel like a moral dilemma. The celebrity developed a reputation for falling apart gradually, failing suddenly, making loud rattling noises that nobody could diagnose, and sending owners back to dealerships with long lists of complaints. But here's the real kicker. Despite all of this, the celebrity sold incredibly well. Why? Fleet sales, rental companies, corporate discounts, government purchases. In short, they were everywhere because large institutions bought them by the thousands. Today, how often do you see a 1985 Chevrolet Celebrity on the road? Never. They vanished faster than VHS rental stores. Why? They rusted. They wore out. They were never worth restoring. They were never beloved. No car clubs, no passionate fan base, no collectible value. The celebrity's true legacy is as a cautionary tale of what happens when a company prioritizes volume over innovation. The 1985 Chevrolet Celebrity was the automotive equivalent of a yawn, a car so dull and uninspiring that it disappeared into the background even when it was new. And when it broke down, as it inevitably did, nobody was shocked and nobody cared. GM set out to build a car for everyone. They succeeded. It was a car for everyone and a car for no one. Number 2. Virgil Exner, the legendary stylist, unleashed the forward look, a radically sleek, low-slung design language that made GM and Ford instantly look old. Chrysler's entire lineup, including the Saratoga, appeared to have come straight from a sci-fi movie. The Saratoga boasted dramatic tail fins, sweeping sidelines, a wide, imposing grille, jet-inspired chrome trim. Designers prioritized bold aesthetics over reliability, and engineers were left scrambling to keep up. What emerged was a car that looked years ahead, but drove years behind. Under the hood sat a V8 engine that looked good on paper, a 354 cubic inch Hemi or torque flight-equipped V8. Respectable horsepower for the era, fast acceleration for such a big car. But in reality, you got a power plant with chronic oil leaks, overheating, valve train issues, weak gaskets, cracking exhaust manifolds. Chrysler was rushing production to beat GM and Ford. Corners were cut. Quality suffered. Owners got a car that could outrun its competition, at least until it overheated or sprayed oil across the driveway. The 1957 Chrysler lineup has become notorious among historians for having some of the worst build quality in Detroit history. The Saratoga suffered from rust outbreaks within 1 year of ownership, poorly aligned body panels, chrome trim falling off, doors that required force just to close, electrical gremlins, flaking paint. The cars were built fast, cheaply, and with little quality control. Chrysler plants were overwhelmed, suppliers couldn't keep up, and the result was an attractive but fragile automobile. On the road, the Saratoga was a handful. While Chrysler touted torsion bar suspension as a technological breakthrough, it came with real downsides: loose steering feel, excessive body roll, rough ride quality, suspension components that wore out quickly, front-end alignment that drifted constantly. Combine that with nearly 2 tons of curb weight, soft drum brakes, a long turning radius, and you had a car that required skill, patience, and forearm strength just to keep in a straight line. Forget efficiency. This thing drank fuel like a B-52 bomber. Reports from owners described single-digit fuel economy when accelerating hard or cruising at highway speeds. Gas stations loved the Saratoga. Owners, not so much. Chrysler's designers went wild with chrome. They plastered it on bumpers, grille, window surrounds, side spears, tail fins. The Saratoga shimmered like a disco ball in the sun. But all that chrome didn't just add weight, it added maintenance headaches. Rust crept under the trim, moisture accumulated behind panels, and plating peeled off like cheap paint. Owning a 1957 Saratoga meant constant surprises. Hard starting on cold mornings, transmission slips, carburetor problems, electrical shorts, leaking seals. Dealerships were overwhelmed with warranty claims. Chrysler's reputation took a massive hit and contributed to the company's steep sales decline in the late 1950s. In short, beautiful on the outside, but a disaster under the skin. Ironically, the very traits that doomed the Saratoga in its day now make it interesting to collectors. Today, it represents a pivotal moment in styling evolution, a tragic clash between ambition and execution, and a symbol of 50s American excess. But even restoration experts admit a 1957 Chrysler is a labor of love and frustration. The 1957 Chrysler Saratoga stands as one of Detroit's most dramatic examples of a car that overpromised and under-delivered. It dazzled buyers, stunned rivals, and pushed design forward, but also exposed the dangers of rushing innovation without the engineering to back it up. It's a reminder that style alone cannot save a car. Not then, not now. Number 1. By the late 1970s, American automakers were in panic mode. The 1973 oil embargo and rising gas prices forced consumers to rethink the massive, thirsty cars that had dominated the previous decade. The LTD II Wagon was Ford's attempt to shrink the full-size sedan just enough to keep it competitive while still offering the luxury and interior space Americans demanded. It looked familiar. Long hood, wide body, boxy wagon rear, chrome trim to signal status, but the era's fuel constraints had already started rendering these dinosaurs obsolete. The LTD II Wagon weighed well over 4,000 pounds, yet it had the engine options of a car that was essentially trying to be lighter. This created a mismatch between mass and power. 302 V8 standard, optional 351 or 400 V8s. Gas mileage low teens in the city, barely mid-teens on the highway. Acceleration sluggish even with the bigger engines. In other words, it was heavy, slow, and thirsty, a recipe for frustration in a fuel-conscious market. The LTD II Wagon suspension was tuned for comfort, not agility. Soft leaf springs in the rear, heavily sprung front end. Long wheelbase and wide track. On paper, this should have given a smooth ride. In reality, body roll was severe. Steering response was vague. Oversteer or understeer could appear suddenly in evasive maneuvers. Combine that with the car's weight, and cornering at anything above 30 miles per hour could feel like piloting a battleship. Families on suburban roads had to drive carefully or risk ending up in a ditch. The wagon relied on front disc and rear drum brakes, standard at the time for many full-size wagons. However, drum brakes faded quickly on long descents. Front brakes could lock up under panic stops. Stopping distances were long, especially with a full load of passengers or cargo. Drivers learned quickly. Reactive braking could be disastrous. In an era before ABS, this was a serious safety concern. The wagon's interior was spacious, seating up to 8 passengers with the optional third-row seat. Features included vinyl upholstery, AM radio, optional air conditioning, wood grain trim to evoke luxury. Despite these comforts, the interior suffered from heavy, clunky doors, poor ergonomics, difficult handling when steering or parking. It was a car designed for status and capacity, not enjoyable driving. The energy crisis had already reshaped the automotive landscape by 1978. Gas-guzzling wagons like the LTD II were increasingly untenable. Expect 12 to 14 mpg city, 16 to 18 mpg highway if you were lucky. Filling up the 22-gallon tank was a monthly headache. Even suburban families who loved the wagon space began to look elsewhere, often turning to smaller imports like Toyota and Datsun. The 1978 Ford LTD II Wagon represents the last gasp of Detroit's full-size wagon obsession. Oversized for the market, underpowered for its weight, poor handling and fuel efficiency. It became a poster child for suburban excess, the car your parents drove while watching the gas meter climb, silently cursing Detroit's insistence on style over sense. The LTD II Wagon wasn't a bad car because of a single flaw. It was the sum of weight, sluggish performance, sloppy handling, and poor efficiency. It epitomized Detroit's struggle to adapt to a new automotive era. For collectors today, it's a quirky relic, huge, chrome-heavy, and endless nostalgic, but a stark reminder that size and comfort alone can't overcome engineering missteps.